Department of Neurology, Division of Neurology. Parallel
reading application.
Hers is more qualitative field study approach. Yeah, go to one of the screens. I have them come in, and afterwards they're not.
I think it'll automatically.
You could actually send a packet to your shoe.
That's okay, because there's no button on it. Like when I go to like here, for example, like here's some stuff. This is the way it was, say, the last time I looked. Say a couple hours ago.
You want this February and your February? I'll just take your February.
I'm giving you my days.
I appreciate
It
that.
is now March.
Excellent. It's March for you, and it's February.
In the little bubble that surrounds me, March on today, and your February.
Yeah, I just have my
Well, Kim figured out that she's blind.
So factor in qualifications of your teachers, standardized test scores of your students.
First ever. I'm not sure if I was.
Check the directory. The directory is, I don't know the key. And I say file. I don't have to check because
So, one drug bust, and all of a sudden your high school's the first in Canada.
I'm left-handed, but I'm right. I use my right arm. Science goes back pressure, which my arm is pretty numb. I don't really feel good. It sounds like I don't have family. I was moving around. I'm often like big guys. Hey, shoulder after the what? Where? My alarm. Yeah, right That's quite used to
Some parents
pictures to his left, kind of flanking. What's
Folks, I think we'll get started. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Sally Fincher, who is a professor of computing education and head of the Computing Education Research Group at the University of Kent in England. Sally needs no introduction within the computer science education research community. In fact, if you talk to anyone in the computer science education research community and they say, well, Sally said, then you know exactly who they're talking about. Sally has many accolades to her name. She is the joint editor of the Journal of Computer Science Education. She was recognized as an ACM Distinguished Scientist in 2009. And in 2010, she was recipient of the ACM SIGSI Award for outstanding contributions to CS education research and for inspiring a generation of computer education researchers. So without any more ado, Sally is going to talk to us today about useful sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, useful sharing. Why do I say useful? Well, frankly, because most isn't. This is a quote from Samuel Johnson, which says, "Between falsehood and useless truth, there is little difference. As gold which he cannot spend will make no man rich, so knowledge which he cannot apply will make no man wise." And in terms of CS education, I think much of what is presented to us is useless truth. And I want to spend some time, certainly the first part of this talk, exploring why I think that should be. And part of the problem is that computer science education, and maybe I have to say any disciplinary specific education, is dominated by unhelpful rhetorics. There's several of them I'm going to particularly lambast two. One is the transfer of best practice, which is just almost nonsensical, because the idea, best practice is incredibly contextualized. Okay? What works at MIT is not going to work at Hoboken College. Really, trust me on this. You know? Best practice at one is not best practice at the other. What's your evidence? For whom? Why? What's your goals? Very, very unhelpful rhetoric. The other is a rhetoric of dissemination. This is sort of the scholarizing, the scientizing of teaching. If we publish at conferences, if we use these forms of dissemination that research use, then we will improve teaching. And that syllogism simply doesn't work. And these are very distorting and very difficult rhetoric. And they don't work because they call on a research model of social networks, of how information crosses institutional boundaries. So let me just talk about research for a moment. Okay. Now, research is an activity that stands outside any one institution. And we understand that. I mean, I can't produce all the research knowledge in my lab that's needed. Okay? I work with your lab, I read the results from his lab, we work together, we produce research in the world. And researchers, bizarrely, gain internal recognition for this external activity. Activity which my institution has no control over. My institution has no control over which journals I edit, which journals publish my papers, who gives me an award, who gives me funding. These all come from external bodies. But my institution goes, they think you're good, we must think you're good too. So research happens elsewhere, happens outside. Or perhaps more precisely, between outsides, between other elsewheres. What Diana Crane and other people have called invisible colleges. So an invisible college is people I've worked with, people I know, people who I did my PhD with, you know, your mentor. Research is exchanged between this kind of invisible college as a matter of course. It's routine. I go to conferences, I talk to you, I talk to you, I talk to you. No one has to make it happen. This is just how knowledge circulates through the community. Teaching isn't like that. Teaching doesn't happen between lots of institutions. Teaching is specific and situated, context matters. It's not only located in institutions, it's located in subject matter. And I teach quite literally in the room you teach in. We've just walked in here, some class filed out, they were sitting there looking at the front, and there was someone at the front talking, and we're doing the same thing. We can seem to be doing the same thing. There's no external visibility, no one else knows we're doing it. Bizarrely, very little recognition, and no extrinsic reward. No one in the institution says, oh, you did a good lecture, well done. So if I'm having troubles teaching public static void main, where do I turn? Well, not institutionally. Because there's no good me going to my colleagues who teach French. By the time I've explained to them what static public void name is, why it's a problem, what the problems students are having, and it's just not going to help. You know, they simply cannot bridge that gap to help me. And CS colleagues from other institutions who do have the domain knowledge and possibly interest have really not much incentive to improve. I mean, they might help me once or twice because they're nice. You know, we're friends. But they're not going to continually come and help me improve my practice. The community of practice for my teaching is very much my department. And the concerns in a department are informed by different rhetoric. Not a research rhetoric, not an exchange rhetoric. They're informed by prerequisites. If I'm teaching a course, do they know what I expect them to know that they've got from your course? Progression. What I teach them, do they take on? Are my colleagues further down the line satisfied with what I'm teaching them? Satisfaction. Are the students satisfied with what we're doing? And do we keep? Those are not judged by what happens elsewhere. They're judged by what happens here to me. Let me tell you about Tracy. Tell you a story which I think illustrates this tension. I was at a workshop, a faculty development workshop, as it happens, at the University of Kent. And this person came in from outside and was talking about how to evaluate teaching and what were good metrics and how to see if students had learned. And they were saying over and over again, you know, how you couldn't trust evaluations weren't any good, evaluations are not sensible usage, not sensible metrics. And Tracy, at the end of this sort of barrage of how you can't use these and they're not very good, said, I get to the end of the year and I think, oh, we're happy students. That's good. And of course for Tracy it is good. If she's got students who are satisfied and are satisfying the prerequisites, and that is a good thing. That's okay.
Could I ask you to move your microphone up on your lapel? It's a little hard to hear in back.
Okay. You can hear it move. How's that?
Better.
Even more?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So there is research. And me, as Paul suggested, I would be one of the very first to defend disciplinary specific educational research as a legitimate research area. And there is teaching, and they are different. And from treating teaching as research may be an interesting argumentative position, it's not useful. So I want to ask, and I want to spend some time asking, what does it mean to treat teaching as teaching? Okay? How might we represent it appropriately, and how can we share it effectively? And so what I want to do is use a theoretical framework to talk about these things. And this comes from knowledge transfer. This comes from people who look at how knowledge moves through organisations and between organisations in sort of a commercial space, not an academic space. And Max Boiseau calls this information space, or actually calls it I space. This is a very large and complicated model. It's three-dimensional, it's cubic, it's quite compelling, but quite complex. So today I'm just going to concentrate on one plane of the cube, as it were. So this is it. This is one side of his model. And the y-axis here, we're talking about knowledge that goes from uncodified to codified. This is one aspect. And at the uncodified end, there's experiential knowledge. So that's stuff we get by living and being and doing. Carpenters have a lot of experiential knowledge. They have a lot of, they know which wood works for which purpose. They know what it feels like to saw it. They know how to glue it, what to use. A lot of experiential knowledge. Codified knowledge, in Boiseau's terms, establishes discernible differences between phenomena on the one hand and between the categories to which they're assigned on the other. Okay, so first of all, he says you can't just have this massive experiential knowledge. You have to say this is important, that's important, and then you have to be able to assign them to categories. I was talking with Elizabeth yesterday. And Elizabeth was talking about teaching people fencing. And she said, when people learn defence, just everything's all together and they think it's about the sword. That's very much a completely undifferentiated experiential knowledge. And then she said, but actually, when they get further then, and as a teacher, you know it's about the feet. And I thought, oh, that's the beginning of codification. That's the beginning of separating this knowledge out into categories and codifying it. Dave Snowden describes codified knowledge as knowledge which can be acquired independently of experience or deployed independently of the knowledge holder. So that's another handle on that. So that's the y-axis. The x-axis goes from concrete to abstract. So concrete knowledge is pretty much something that you cannot fully articulate. It's called tacit knowledge. It's stuff that we can't articulate and probably can't fully represent. Concrete is embodied in us. There's not much we can do to externalise it. Abstract knowledge, on the other hand, is explicit, clear, unambiguous, precise, and separated from behaviour. It's not embodied. It's not in personality. And Boiseau says that abstract knowledge minimises the use of categories by only drawing on those that are relevant for a given purpose. So it's important to understand this isn't a mathematical notion of abstraction. This isn't the general case, you know, the higher you go, the more cases you encompass. This is actually reductionist, so that abstract knowledge, you draw only on those parts of experience that are relevant to this case. So those are the definitions, and you have to have definitions, otherwise, you know, it all gets a bit purposeless. But I'm going to give you some examples now to try and instantiate this. So down at the uncodified and concrete end of the plane are classically Zen masters. Not only is their knowledge concrete, embodied, they actually strive not to codify it. They actually strive not to put it into separate categories. If you think of their koans, their very strange sort of apprenticeships, they actually resist codification of knowledge. And at the other end, at the top there, and this is Max Boiseau's illustration, is a bond trader. He says, if you are exchanging squillions of dollars with someone on the other side of the room on a strange sort of handshake, and you better know what that means. It's highly codified, highly abstract. You only use certain portions to understand what's going on. Dave Snowden has another example of this. It's a London taxi driver. I don't know if you know about London taxi drivers. London taxi drivers, to be a London taxi driver, and it has to be one of those cabs, one of those black cabs, are trained. They're not minicab drivers. They don't just turn up and they can get in the car and drive away. And what they do is, it's called the knowledge. They do the knowledge. What the knowledge is you have to learn 364 routes. It's called the Blue Book. You're given the Blue Book when you register. There are 364 routes, and you have to learn them. And then you have to present yourself to be examined on these once a month, I think it is. And you turn up and they say, all right, tell me how to get from Turnham Green to Marble Arch. And the taxi driver has to talk the route, giving every turn, left or right, as the route goes along. And for a quarter-mile radius at either end, they have to give all the landmarks and points of interest that a tourist might be interested in. It has a very high failure rate. But one of the interesting things is that the taxi drivers that do pass this and do go out to the streets of London have a permanently enlarged hippocampus. There's something about large-scale navigation of knowledge spaces that actually changes the shape of their brain. And really, you can't get more embodied than that. So that's uncodified, concrete knowledge. They've driven these streets. They know exactly what's going on and how to get there. Now, of course, you can abstract and codify that. This is London A to Z, which has all the streets in it. And theoretically, the same knowledge that the taxi driver has. You know, it has the points of interest. You can read the map and show where all the turnings go left and right. And in fact, in one sense, we can abstract it even further, and we have done technologically with sat-nav, so you don't, someone else does it for you. But this is particularly fragile knowledge. It doesn't talk about roadworks, doesn't talk about accidents, it doesn't, once you abstract knowledge, once you codify it, it becomes much more difficult to actually deal with. Let me give you an example. This is from Daniel Patterson. And he says, I've never been much for technology, so when I bought a car recently that came with GPS, I imagined the device would go largely unused. A few months later, on my way to visit friends at their new home in Oakland, California, I decided to give it a try. A patient, yet firm, woman's voice guided me easily to the exact location, and much to my surprise, I fell in love with the feature. So far, so good. Then one night, as I drove to see my friends for the 4th or 5th time, I realised I had no idea how to get there. I'd been blindly following instructions from a disembodied voice without paying attention to where I was going. So I think this illustrates quite clearly the fragility of that abstract knowledge. It's entirely the opposite of the concrete and embodied knowledge of the taxi driver, who knows extremely well how to get there and can do it forwards and backs and tell you the points of interest along the way. He had no idea. He was simply using this codified abstract knowledge. Give me another example of this. Let me tell you about Chromium. Chromium is a short story. It's a short story by Primo Levi, who was an Italian chemist. He was a Jewish Italian chemist and was incarcerated in the concentration camps in the Second World War. And when he came out, he wrote this book. He wrote several books, but this is one. It's called The Periodic Table. And he takes each element and he writes a little parable or a short story about it, illustrating his experiences. And the story about Chromium is he talks about one of the first chemical factories he worked in. And one of the things they made was varnish. And so what he did as a young industrial chemist is he went and he got the formula book, because that's what you get the formula book, this abstract, codified book, and you bring it down and you open it up and you say, what do you have to do? You have to put in so many gallons of linseed oil, which you have to boil. And so you put the gallons of linseed oil in the boiler and you turn it on. And this formula book also said, when you start doing that, you put in 2 slices of onion. And you heat it up to so many degrees, and then you scoop the onion out, and then you put the other stuff in it. You carry on. And he did this, as everybody did in that factory, for years. And then finally he asked one of the oldest chemists there, and he said, why do we do this? Does it make our varnish better? Is it our secret ingredient? Is it? And the old chemist said, no. He said, what it is when we first started making this, we didn't have automatic temperature control. So you put the onion in, and when it started to fry, you knew it was hot enough. It demonstrates some of the fragility of abstract and codified knowledge. One last example. This is my friend, Clive Barlow. Clive Barlow is a master of wine. I don't know if you know about masters of wine. Similar but different to taxi drivers. They also have to pass a very rigorous exam. They have to know how wine is made, where it comes from, what the differences are, what makes a difference, what terroir means. And they have to pass, to become a master of wine, you have to pass blind tasting tests. So they line up 5 glasses and you have to identify exactly what's in each and where it comes from. And you can codify this knowledge. I mean, people have, you can write encyclopedias about where wine comes from and how it's made. You can have these wonderful maps that show you all the regions of France, but frankly, when I'm sitting there with 2 glasses of red wine in front of me, that doesn't help. 2 different glasses of red wine. Inner wine tasting. I'm not racking it up for the Okay. So if we have these 2 parts of the plane, situated embodied knowledge and the abstract symbolic knowledge, one of these is very familiar to us. This is a very, very familiar form of representation. We're academics. We see it a lot. And I want to have a look at I think, a not atypical research representation. I'm taking it from a journal called Angot Chemie, which I understand means applied chemistry. and that's what it looks like. Sort of a page from their journal looks like. Quite different from a page from a computer science journal or indeed history journal. And a typical paper is about 3 pages long. One page contains experimental detail, half a page is endnotes. The body of the article is in about 1.5 printed pages, about a third is graphics. So there it is. And a particular feature of Angot Chemie is the mandatory inclusion of an experimental section detailing procedures. There it is. It's the mandatory section at the end. Let's have a look at that. And it says, my glasses. Tell you what it says. You may be able to read it yourselves. It says, all pyridium bromide salts were prepared by the literature method. The BF4 salts was it. Fine. Okay. This is a general statement that, in effect, states that anyone, anytime, anywhere who treats the same ingredients in the same way as I did will make the same chemical compound. This is highly codified. Not only in the representations, in the textual representations of the chemicals and the formulae, but also in the process, by the literature method, through this sort of very codified knowledge. It's also highly abstract. Remember this definition of abstract that calls only on as many categories as you need? So here, I mean, this is organic chemistry. It's going to smell a bit, right? Okay? But there's nothing there. There's nothing about smell, there's nothing about taste, there's nothing about what equipment you should use, or how, it's just this highly abstract category, drawing on only those that we need. Teaching's not like this. Replication of teaching practice is not guaranteed by the scientific method. I cannot treat the same ingredients in the same way as you, get the same result. I can't even do it at the same time in subsequent classes. I treat my ingredients the same way and get the same result. But my classroom practice, your results are useless truths. So if that's the rather familiar abstract end, we also have quite a familiar situated embodied knowledge, concrete knowledge. So not a research representation, but a representation of teaching. This is from my own institution. I didn't think it was fair to use anybody else's. But I have actually taken off the module number to protect the innocent. So this is a representation that we produce in my department for every course, every time it runs. Okay? And on the y-axis you get the marks for this module. Okay, so this is from 0 to 100. And on the x-axis, it's the average module mark for the student. So every other module they've taken, we average the marks together. And then each dot is a student. Okay? The histogram just repeats data on the side, so you get a different graphical representation.
Could you explain what a module?
Of course, sorry. Of course, it's a single, yeah. Sorry, of course. And then the black line is the perfect distribution, and the red line is the trend. And the red line in my department is the important one. So here, if you look at the red trend line and you look at the dots, the better students don't do so well. Okay? And the weaker students tend to do better on this particular module. It's also a module that has a lot of group work. Some people think that's a bad thing. Just to give you a contrast, this is the same one we've just seen, and this is a new one. One over here is a new module, which you haven't seen before. You can see it has quite a different pattern. Here, almost all students do better. On this module than any other module they've done, almost all students do better. And there's a rather suspicious line here at 40%, which is our pass mark. Some people think this is a bad thing. Okay, we can endlessly discuss this, and we do. But actually, these are entirely local, entirely contextual. They're entirely accurate, don't get me wrong, but to anyone who's not in my department, entirely useless. This is is just another form of useless truth. And so this model, or this part of the model that I've presented, illuminates two of the perplexities, I think, of this teaching and research. And the first perplexity is, why don't best practices transfer from your classroom to my classroom? And it's because the information is local, situated, embodied, just like those modular representations. That's my practice. And yours is the same. Yours sits in your department and it lives within your context. And just making it available, just showing it to you, doesn't help transfer at all. The second reason, the second perplexity, which is when I'm teaching why don't I use your research results, is because your codified and abstracted knowledge is just too far removed from my context. But it circulates through the research community, because that's how research works. It doesn't affect me, it doesn't get down to me. If that's what it illuminates, how does it help? I think it helps because it distinguishes activities that are fundamentally different. And quite often in academia we confuse it because most of us do research and teaching, we think we should do them in the same way. But we don't want teaching to be abstract and symbolic. Right? That's professors reading their textbooks. It doesn't help. Equally, we don't want research to be localised and contextualised because we need it to be abstract, we need it to circulate. That's exactly why we write books and papers, so that we can exchange it with our research colleagues. Another reason I think Boiseau's model helps is because it not only identifies this problem, it gives us a way to overcome it. So there's our familiar plane of eye space, and that in the middle is what I am pleased to call the gap of useless truth. And the way that Boiseau suggests information passes across this boundary is in narrative knowledge, which is neither situated nor abstract. Narrative is interesting because it mediates between the two. It's not simplistic. Narrative encourages a very rich and complex set of associations. And it allows us, in one way, from the embodied to the abstract, to allow us to structure our embodied experience and become amenable to sharing. Let me tell you about Burgundy. Do you remember Clive Barlow, my friend, the master of wine I showed you earlier? Well, I've been going to wine tasting classes with Clive Barlow for 2-3 years now. And early on, he was sort of taking us through each kind of classic variety, so we'd understand, we'd have kind of a reference palette. We'd know what to refer back to when he said this is a classic Bordeaux or this. And one evening we were doing Burgundy, and he opened this fantastic bottle of Burgundy and poured it all out. And we took the glasses as we'd been taught, we swelled them, we sniffed them. And I sniffed this and I went, silently, oh dear, something's wrong. And as he was pouring out the wine and as he was talking about it, Clive started telling a story. And he said, when he was first learning to taste wine, his mentor opened this fantastic bottle of Burgundy and poured it out. And he sniffed it and he thought, oh, this wine's off, how can I tell her? This is dreadful, And then his mentor poured a glass of wine and she smelt it and she swirled it around and he went, oh, great, she's going to find out. And then she sniffed it and she took a mouthful and she said, I do love a really shitty Burgundy. And that mediated immediately for us the embodied experience that we were having, that this wine did not smell floral, this wine did not smell sweet, this wine did not smell fruity. Burgundy smells pretty vegetal. Particularly some French Burgundy is pretty composty. So we immediately learned that this was okay, this is how it's meant to smell. Suddenly, it allowed us to codify and abstract our experience. And it was the narrative that did that, that allowed us to bridge this gap. And narrative's nice because it's very conducive. It's conducive to the teller, so it's always from the storyteller's point of view. No one tells a story from someone else's point of view. And it's conducive to the listener. It's very easy to receive. If you tell me a story, a how-I story, It makes no demands on me. It makes no demands on my context. I don't have to do it like you. I'm just listening to your story. And I can take the important parts, I consider to be the important parts of your story, and bring it into my own practice. Your practice becomes mine because I can just bring your experience to bear on my own. And narratives are very familiar. We have abstract, symbolic representations in teaching. This is a textbook written by one of my colleagues, which has really a pretty good definition of polymorphic inheritance in it. But, you know, doesn't matter how many good definitions of polymorphic inheritance you get if these guys can't define a class. So what do we do as teachers in that kind of situation? And I've been around your department for 3 days, and I've seen people do this. I've seen students come up with their laptops open and go, what's wrong, sir, what's wrong, you know? And we look, and we tell them, what do? We tell them illustrations, metaphors, explanations, stories, narratives. We don't say, go and look in the book. We don't repeat the definition. We mediate their experience with narrative. So, Woz's model, which I like, gives us a framework here for understanding why best practices don't travel. But educators do change their practice. So what's going on here? How does this happen? How does it work? Well, change is an interesting animal. And change in teaching, I think, is not a technical challenge, it's an adaptive one. And this is Ronald Heifetz's terms. So a technical challenge is something that can be solved by an expert. So if you're ill, you go to the doctor, and he says, oh, you're terribly ill, we've got to mend the valves in your heart, you have heart surgery. Or your car breaks down and you get the mechanic, and he replaces the broken part. This is very much the best practices rhetoric, technical challenge. You've got a problem, here's a solution, it'll fix it. There you go. And I have a couple of nice quotes here. This is taken off from Mergadeller. The implicit assumption is that if educators are exposed to carefully presented and understandable research findings, they will recognise the wisdom of the results and immediately apply them in their daily practice. If only. I hesitate to say so, but I believe that we pedagogues tend to exaggerate greatly the amount of change in educational practice that results from reading what other people say should be done. These are technical representations. This is change as if it's a technical challenge. Adaptive change is different. An adaptive challenge is where we're part of the problem. Okay? And we have to change along with the circumstances. So we go to the mechanic and he says the problem isn't the car, it's how you drive it. Okay? Actually, you've got to change your behaviours and what you do. Or the doctor says that if you can have heart surgery, but if you don't change your behaviour, you're going to get worse. You're not going to get better. You're going to have to change your lifestyle. You're going to have to eat less fat, exercise more, Pop quiz. What is the percentage of post-surgery behavioural change? It's people's lives we're talking about. How many people actually take the advice of their surgeon?
10.
10%? You have a pretty depressed view of human nature.
So this is after they've had surgery?
Yes.
30%.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You've bracketed it. It's 20%. Post-surgery compliance and behaviour change is 20%. That's not very high, I think. Okay. I think teaching is almost always an adaptive challenge, not a technical one. It's we that have to change. We have to change what we do in the classroom. We have to change our behaviours. We have to change our values. We have to change from what we know and do and we're comfortable with. And it's as hard as post-surgery behaviour. So how do you help people do that? How do we usefully share our knowledge to help people come to terms with changing practice as an adaptive process? Well, if you look at other disciplines and other practices, it turns out that they have some interesting models of how they do this. So medical practitioners, family doctors, GPs we call them, general practitioners, have what they call Ballant groups. It's named after the guy who developed them, Dr. Ballant. And they have groups where they come together and they talk about the doctor-patient relationship and interaction. Architects and other studio-based disciplines, something where you have a physical artifact you can look at or a picture you can put on the wall, have critics. Everybody comes round and it comes from criticise and gives an honest opinion. Musicians and dancers have masterclasses, so that's where someone who's not your regular teacher comes in, some other expert comes in, and you learn from them for an hour or 2 hours. So you get a different perspective on your practice and how you're working. And therapeutic professions, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, things like that, have what they call supervisions, where a more experienced practitioner partners with you and you have a session, normally once a week, discussing your patients and your relationships. And Uruguayan farmers have calzone quiteo groups. Yeah, I know. Uruguayan farmers. It's great, isn't it? Uruguayan farmers had this collective reflection. It started in about the 1950s. This is a particular example I have. And it came about because to be successful in farming requires an enormous amount of tacit knowledge and understanding about how to make things work in a coordinated way, and the success has a long time frame. That sounded quite familiar to me. And what they did was they had this particular instantiation. They had 8 small farms. They used to come together, they used to meet monthly, and they used to visit each other's farm in turn, providing a lot of information beforehand. So you came prepared to talk and look at what was going on. So, for instance, here's some of the preparatory material. So here's a plan of the farm. This is how much cattle they had, sheep. No, this is the original over here, and this is the modern translation and transliteration. So this says how much the projection the land's going to produce in rye and sorghum. And so what happened? So they had all these documents beforehand, and on the day of the visit, they had a discussion, they had a tour of the farm, and then there was a session at the end of the day where the other farmers said, "Okay, this is what we think. This is how you should change." And this is an email from one of the farmers who participated in that. And he said a very important point was the insistence that the meeting should be with underpants removed, which means you have to put all your cards on the table, hide nothing. And we often require the presence of the wife to stand up her views. So the recognition that this context was complete. You couldn't just see half of it. You have to have the whole picture. At the end of the meeting, the leaders of the group reported on all their group recommendations, and sometimes there emerged some truths or criticisms which were very painful. This is what I think helped many to come to terms with reality. So a very interesting form of joint reflection. Quits, masterclasses, ballet groups, calzone quiteo groups. What do they have in common? If you're looking at these other practices from other disciplines, well, they're out of place. They don't take place in the normal routine. You're not asked to reflect immediately whilst you're doing the practice. You're not, the doctor isn't with you having a consultation going, "Oh, now hang on, let me reflect on this." Okay. So they're not in the same place that you do it, but they take practice, embodied, concrete, quasos, bottom left corner practice, as their point and purpose. It's an abstraction of it, looking at the practice. So can we do it? What would it mean for us to have a forum, a community that allows us to purposely reflect on teaching as itself, or abstracted or codified, that doesn't make teaching into something else and doesn't make us document it in an inappropriate form? A journal paper is a really dreadful way to represent teaching. It's a very good way to represent research. It's a very bad way to represent. So what would that look like? Okay, here's one I prepared earlier. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and so this is a model that I developed with Josh Tenenberg from the University of Washington, Tacoma, to do precisely that. And so a disciplinary commons aims to document and share knowledge about teaching and student learning, to create a teaching-appropriate document of practice that is equivalent to the research-appropriate journal paper. And what it is we have between 10 and 20, normally, practitioners who are teaching the same subject, often the same course, module, paper, whatever terminology you use. But they're teaching at different institutions. And we come together once a month throughout the academic year, so we're taking it out of place, but we're coming together to purposely reflect on our practice and document it in an appropriate fashion. And in this way, I think we get two benefits. We get participation and we get reification. And I want to talk about those separately. So participation is what brings everybody together. They go, oh, fantastic. We come to the meetings, we come once a month, we share, we review each other's work, we bring assessments, we bring evaluations, we bring, oh, this is what I do in the first week, this is what I do in the second. We have those very deep and detailed discussions, although with our underhands on. But these discussions are often of a very particular kind. Because just like farming, I think to be successful, teaching also requires an enormous amount of tacit knowledge and understanding about how to make things work in a coordinated way, and success has a long time frame. Let me give you a flavour of the sort of discussion that I'm talking about. Tell you about Bob and Alice. So Bob and Alice are in a common situation. They're in this disciplinary forum that is outside their usual place of work. And they're discussing an activity that Alice has in very early on in her course, actually. It's an intro course. She has it in about week 2 or 3, I think it is. And she wants to get students to use pseudocode and flowcharts to describe how to select the second largest element in the list. And Alice says, this section seems really, really hard. And Bob says, I meant, this is, when it's in italics, it's actually a direct quote. Okay. So Bob says, I mentioned I thought the logic was quite challenging for students for a first exposure to selection. I asked her why such nested logic, 2 levels for largest, 3 for second largest, when she teaches selection several weeks later. I asked, what is the point? Fair question, I thought. And Alice said, it's just about using the tools. I just want them to get used to producing pseudocode and flowcharts. Bob said, I suggested she might want to have students use manipulatives, say cards with numbers on them. And I said, here's how to use them the wrong way. Ask the students to pick the largest of 3 numbered cards, writing down how they did it. The students will just say, I picked the largest. Of course they would. We understand this. We know what's going on. But Bob doesn't stop there. Bob carries on and says, I said you have to constrain the task. Place 3 cards face down. Choose the largest of the 3 when you can have, at most, 2 up at any one time. And we understand what's going on here, what he's trying to get at, how he's trying to get to what the students past the problem. Or he said you can choose the largest when you only hand them a card one at a time. A different solution, different paradigm. He says you can do this in groups. One person doing it, the other person observing and recording. They can discuss the algorithm, try to other values and see if it generalises. Then they can do it as a whole class and you can critique. With this method, they might even be able to do the second largest. You have to settle for very rough pseudocode and certainly not flowcharts. I don't think. Well, some of us may disagree more, but I thought it was right. And that particular flavour of conversation, that very, very close, detailed, deep understanding conversation is, I think, not content knowledge, I don't think it's general pedagogical knowledge, I don't think it's curriculum knowledge, or any of the more generic things. I think it's what Lee Schulman calls pedagogical content knowledge. She describes it as that special amalgam of content and pedagogy that is uniquely the province of teachers, their own special form of professional understanding. Because this conversation emerged from Bob having done exactly the sort of thing that Alice was trying to do, and knowing very clearly how students would react to a topic like that. Because Alice could understand what was going on, because she too had that deep disciplinary experience to draw on. She knew it wasn't working, she knew it wasn't going very well, she didn't know why, they were levering off each other's knowledge. And this is a quote from Bob. Bob says, "This conversation was all about the specifics. In a cross-disciplinary group, you would never have that kind of conversation. You might have other very good and important things to say to one another, but you wouldn't have that conversation. Never." Special form and professional understanding. I'm beginning to think, the more I look at this, the more I hear conversations like that happening in very special circumstances and not in others, that pedagogical content knowledge may only be transmitted by narrative, by disciplinary practitioners talking together. It's hard to imagine a book of it. I mean, you sometimes see them try, 52 tips and tricks of how to do this, but they somehow seem still to prevent quite well. Certainly, the gap of useless truth here has been bridged by the disciplinary background, the shared disciplinary understanding. And it's taken these abstract techniques, you could do it in groups, you could do it like this, you could do it like that, and brought them down precisely to classroom practice. And of course, by it being narrative, they've transferred this institutional context. Actually, this has moved from one classroom to another in a very sympathetic way. So that's what the participation in commons, I think, brings. The reification of our practice, the trying to produce it in a teaching appropriate way, we do by creating course portfolios. So over the course of the year of these meetings, we come together and have these meetings, but then we document our courses in a course portfolio. And these portfolios, I think, are special, partly because they have a common form. If you look at portfolio pictures, they're often very different. They look different, they don't have the same sections, they're individualistic, and that's hard. They're very engaging, they're very compelling, but it's hard to compare, it's hard to take information out of them. So disciplinary commons portfolios have a common form which we mandate. And I think there's great power of having a bunch of portfolios about the same subject matter. So instead of saying how one person taught CS1, you can see how 17 taught CS1, and you can line through. And also, they're created from a body of people, so they're very contextualised. They're very contextualised within the discipline. So what is this mandated form? Each portfolio has 6 sections. Some of them are sneaking in the 7s. They're sneaking. People want to put in teaching philosophies. I don't mind, but the mandated form that we came up with was this, that this is what we thought people needed to know. If you come to my teaching, what do you need to know? You need to know my context. You need to know if I'm working at MIT or Hoboken College. You really do. You need to know the content. You need to know what material I'm trying to teach, what level, and to how many students, and over what time period. You need to know my instructional design. You need to know, why do I use labs, why do I use lectures, why do I use classes, why do I use stickers, why do I use group exams. You need to know my instructional design, why I'm using this. You need to know my delivery. How do I do? Am I very stiff in the classroom? Am I more engaging? Do I see students out of hours? Do I not? You need to know my delivery. You need to know how I assess. You need to know how I know it's working, how the students know it's working. And you need to know evaluation, not only how the students evaluate me, but how my department evaluates me, my institution evaluates me, how I evaluate the module. There's a number of aspects to that. So those are the 6 sections. And each of those sections contains an artifact, a naturally occurring piece of evidence from the course that's being taught. Not a general course, not a generic course, not someone else's course, not how you taught it last time or how you will teach it next time. This course, this delivery, now. And you choose that artifact to represent what you want to say about those categories. So some portfolios have a lot more, for instance in content, than they do in delivery and vice versa, because that's what the educator wants to emphasise. they have the artifact, and then they have a commentary. Why they chose it, how they felt about it, what it says, what their questions are, commentary with it. So they have the detail and the discussion, the evidence and the narrative, what and the why. And so these, I think, are very appropriate representations of teaching. They're personal, they have a voice, they tell you what that educator thinks is important, but they're not idiosyncratic. They share enough common form, enough codification to actually allow us access to it. So the benefits of structure like this, all commoners are expert. If I'm the facilitator in the room, effectively I know nothing. It doesn't matter about what my knowledge is. They're the experts. They're the ones that are actually investigating and sharing. They work together, so you have that collegiality. And interestingly, one of the things we do that we thought was just an extra, and turned out to be very important, is cross-institutional peer observation. So we actually, one of us will go to another person's class to watch you teach, because in a situation of a commons, the only point of doing that is for me to help you. If it happens within my institution, it's often someone's assessing me, I'm up for tenure, I'm being evaluated. There's always a power relationship. In the commons, there isn't. It turns out to be quite. And what happens is, throughout the course of the year, we have a very detailed knowledge of what happens in 15, 16, 17 other departments. That's extremely unusual. Quite common for research. If I don't know what's happening in the research lab, in the college down the road, I'm in trouble. If I don't know what's happening they're teaching, who cares? However, what we found is that possession of this knowledge is recognised by colleagues. Colleagues go, oh, they know. They understand how teaching is shaped and how it works out in different places. And the knowledge gets valued, and then the commoners get extra value within their institution. And so the benefit of the reification is the documentation gives you not just my interpretation, but because it's in this collegial context, it's been produced as a reflection amongst a group of people, it's that many steps removed from my singular tacit embodied experience. I've had 10 eyes, 17 eyes, 15 eyes on this. So the narrative knowledge, I think, bridges the gap of useless truth. I don't read a portfolio to be told how I should run a course. I read a portfolio to find out how you did it. I can abstract bits from that would suit me, because I know my context very well. You don't have to tell me what my context is. I know my context, and I can match it against yours, and I can see wow. I know what will work for me. Narrative is natural, and actually, there is no shortage of stories, and not just from places like the Commons. You don't just get them there. And this is why we all know it. We walk around the corridors. But Drury Altiero says, informal storytelling occurs where there is a story to tell, a willing listener or listeners, and a suitable physical space. Water coolers, hallways, cars on your way to work, canteens. We all know they call them liminal spaces, these spaces that are in between the actual classrooms and places where we live work. Victoria Little, although she's talking about school teachers here, but she says accounts of teaching experience punctuate teachers' talk with one another in a range of workplace contexts. Staff rooms, hallways, encounters, regularly scheduled meetings. We know this. Narrative occurs all over the place, and it's highly valuable, but there are problems. There's a problem of persistent representation, and there's a problem of indexing. Let's talk about both of these. So the problem of persistent representation is how do you capture them? They're very valuable, they're very useful, but how do you capture them and how do you make them available to other people? So over time, I've been pretty influenced by patterns and pattern languages. They've become very popular in software as well, so I'm not going to dwell too long on what they are. But they are a way of developing a common design vocabulary. The definition is, and they're structured around problems in design. And the definition is, each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way that you can use this solution 1,000,000 times over without ever doing it the same way twice. Great model of useful sharing. They were first codified by Christopher Alexander, who was an architect, or is an architect. And he talks very eloquently about how he came to this. He just graduated. He was very young, he was 23, 24. And he was asked by the Indian government to come and design a village in an area of India. And it was very lucrative. It was a very prestigious contract. And he thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. And he said no. He said, I can't do it because I don't know what it means. I don't know what your context is. I don't know what it means to live like an Indian. I know my context, but I don't know yours. But he recognised he did have expertise, which they didn't. And he wanted a way to try and give them that expertise. And he says, and it was then I started dreaming about patterns. And this book was the result, these 253 patterns. So these are architectural patterns, and a pattern language has form. They all look the same, they all have the same bits. So we recognise this as codified knowledge. They have key abstractions. They combine the abstract and the concrete. So they give you the principle, then they give you a way to instantiate it. They have a value system. You want to do a good design, not a bad design. And they have a structuring principle. They're organised so you can index your way in. You can find what you want. And his patterns are organised by scale from the city level to the house level. Here's one of my favourites. Here's 159, light on two sides of every room. So first of all, they have a title, so you can refer to it. You get a design shorthand, and when we know software patterns, things like, you'll go around and people say, oh, you need a flywheel there. We're using the shorthand vocabulary, the title of the pattern. You then get a sensitising example. In architectural patterns, it's a photograph. And I think the reason this is there is that you look at it and you go, ooh, that's really nice. I'd like a room like that. And it sensitises you to the content of the pattern. In software patterns, you get a code fragment often. You then get how it fits with the larger scale patterns. That's how it fits in. Then you get the problem statement. So this is when they have a choice. People gravitate to rooms and light on two sides. The body of the pattern, which can go on for a long time, then gives you the detail, the rationale, the evidence, all the bits that go to make up why he thinks this is a good thing. Then you get the solution to the pattern. So if that was the problem, this is the solution. And this is at a general level. Okay? You get the detail in the middle. This is the general level. You get a technical diagram to show you how to instantiate it. And then it shows you how this lower level pattern's part of this. So that's a quick walk through the form of an architectural pattern. So this is a project I did 10 years ago now. And we took this form to try and capture the narratives and give them a persistent representation that we were hearing people talking about project work. We were doing a project about computer science project work. And so we adapted the pattern form. We called these bundles. Why? And we adapted the pattern form. So we had a general statement at the top, a general problem statement, a general solution statement. Then in the middle, we articulated the stories that people were telling us. In fact, we transcribed them, we reworked them into this form, using what we call formulaic phrases. Which is, this bundle is, the way it works is, it works better is, if, and it doesn't work unless. So here's a real one. This is a pattern called red card, yellow card. Footballing metaphor. So here's the problem statement, which is students and staff alike are reluctant to reward group members who do not contribute, although some groups seem perfectly happy to carry a hitchhiker. In either case, it's impossible for staff to know precisely how much work each team member did. Only the students know that. Sound familiar? Yeah, sure. It's a problem, okay? So that's the problem. The statement here in the middle uses the formulaic phrases. So this is what you do. You can go and read it if you want to. This is how you make it work. There's a solution statement, which is find a mechanism which devolves control over performance of group members to the groups themselves. So in our case, the problem statement and the solution statement are general, and the bit in the middle is a specific way to do this, a particular piece of practice which will instantiate this. And we organise these not by scale. It's very hard to think what scale might mean in terms of project work, but we organise them by the 6 areas that you need to consider, which is allocation of students to groups, supervisors to students, topics to students, allocation, supervision, assessment, reflection, teams, and motivation. It's kind of a coarse bucket to throw narratives into, but we only had 46 patterns, you know. Alexander had to. Actually, bundles have had an afterlife, and today I've been using as an elicitive form. So instead of me going out and gathering narratives and rewriting them and packaging them, I've been getting people to do it themselves. And actually, this is kind of easy. I was kind of surprised at how easy people find this to do. You can get to have a piece of practice, describe it using the headings, using the narrative headings here. You ask people to give it a name and outline a situation in which someone else would find it useful. And those people find it very easy to sit and write that down. You can capture these natural narratives in a persistent form really quite easily. So the form and the formulaic phrases help codify that singular experience to make it available. And the narrative body helps bridge that gap of useless truth between my experience and yours. So if that's one of the problems of persistent representation of natural narrative, there is also a problem of indexing. Narratives are hard to find. I think that Kurtz worked at IBM, looking at trying to take e-learning solutions and percolate them throughout the company. Useful sharing, that's what she was trying to do. And she did a lot of work capturing stories, like I did with project work, and trying to repackage them. And she came to the realization, we began to see that a raw story of personal experience is a priceless gem that cannot be taken apart and put back together without removing its powerful qualities, retaining its natural quality. And so they abandoned their idea of gathering all these stories together and repackaging them, making them available to other people. And they said, well, we'll just take these natural narratives and we will figure out a way of getting the stories to where they needed to be. How do you index them? How do you... All those corridor conversations you have, all those nice, deep, disciplinary conversations you have, how do you have them when you need them? How do you get stories to where they need to be? Where do you look to find that, other than going down the corridor and knocking on John's door? I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't think we know. And I'm sorry about that. If I've led you to a cliff edge and left you hanging there, I don't think we know. But I am trying to find out. And the current project, the Sharing Practice project, we're gathering these very rich naturalistic data, what I call researcher-absent methodologies. So I'm trying not to put my ideas in between what you want to tell us. And we're in the last phase of our data gathering, and what we're trying to get is change stories, narratives of how educators actually change their practice. What do they look at? Where do they go to? What happens when they use the idea? Did it work? Did it not? Was it... I don't care what the actual story is, as long as we have lots. And please join in. There's a URL there. Will be open until the 4th of March. Please submit your stories of how you've changed your practice. Because we're using an unusual methodology where we're taking these anecdotal fragments and then we're using statistical techniques. So we need statistical power, we need volume. More is better. And so with this data, what we're looking, amongst other things, is to find out where people look. Can we put stories in those places? Can we put narratives there that will actually help people share practice better? So Christopher Alexander structured his patterns by scale. A very suitable architectural metaphor. We, in project work, structured them by the bits of stuff we thought were important. I don't think we did a very good job. So I'm going to end by sharing what I think is quite an exciting opportunity, but I understand that your mileage may vary. But I'm a member of the steering committee of the Computing Curriculum 2013 group, which is about as exciting as it sounds. So we have a lot of meetings and we do a lot of talking, and it's all quite detailed. But this committee is ambitious. I don't know if you know previous computing curricula documents. They're very dense. They say, you know, you should teach this, you should teach this, you should teach this, this is core, this is optional, and it's really a list of topics. But this committee want to illustrate, ruminate perhaps, their curricular document with case studies, with how this topic has been instantiated in various ways at a community college, where this topic's been instantiated at an R1, in various curricular contexts, examples, narratives. And they're doing this because, well, the reason I'm involved is we think educators may very well look for these disciplinary structures. This may be a place where people would look for this kind of useful sharing, for this kind of advice, this kind of material that might actually help us adapt and change our practice. So I'm chairing the HCI knowledge area, but, so you can talk to me about that, but every knowledge area is seeking this experience, and if you're interested to share your experience of instantiating parts of the curriculum, we want to know. Okay. Thank you for listening.
We have sort of another time for a few questions, if there are any questions for Sally.
You talked about patterns and then you talk about these narratives. Are you planning to create, I guess, more patterns out of that, or are these patterns really specific to a discipline, or are there more general patterns that educators can use across?
I think a pattern is a very sympathetic representational form. I think it does a lot of work in a very compact package. I think the problem is indexing. I don't think the problem is the form. Everybody gets seduced by the form. Everybody goes, oh, that's really cute, that's really wonderful. And it is. But actually, unless you have the structuring principle, where you say, this is one of these, and you go and put your hand on one of those, and no, I don't think anybody's cracked that. I think that's a very, very hard job. And so I think that's the problem with patterns. And we may try and do some, but can't guarantee it.
So the idea is to use the patterns to index the narratives in the end.
You can use the patterns to package the narratives. The indexing, the structuring principle, how these fit together, has to come from somewhere else. And it may be a curriculum. We'll find out.
One thing I've always noticed about the education literature, the CS education literature, is there's these papers that are called Marco Polo papers or Star Trek papers where the author will describe, we tried this in the classroom, boldly went where no one had gone before, and this is what we found. How do you see that as relating to the, narratives you've been talking about?
I don't think narratives make those kind of claims. And I think partly it's about form. Partly when we borrow a research representation, this idea of a journal paper, it's some kind of second-hand legitimacy. Somehow it's kind of, well, if teaching looks like research, if we put it in the same form, then we'll get the honours and the awards, and the information will circulate in the same way. I think so I think partly it's that narratives are placed differently, they live in different places, they don't pretend to be paper.
Do you think the large number of Marco Polo papers indicate that...
Indicates the ego of computer science educators, possibly.
Oh, I was going to say that people want to share what they've been doing.
Maybe. Perhaps not usefully share. I think it's more about reputation. Honestly. That's how we get known. You know, it's not bad or wrong. It's just not very useful. Hi, you go.
So I appreciate their importance of narratives and experiences. I think that personally I would give them different role. I'll explain in a minute. So the metaphors you began with, and when you discussed abstraction, are interesting, such as the wine testing and the cow dragon. But maybe a closer metaphor is the medical field, right? So each individual grows in a different environment, and we're susceptible to other influence. Right? We eat differently, we exercise differently, we breathe differently. And these things are highly contextualized and highly localized, right? What people consume in this area is very different than in other areas. And still when we come to understand how the human body works and to come up with medication, there are principles that can be followed and applied. So we won't find out a single medication that reduces fever always for everyone. That would be silly to look for it. But we can say that for this specific for this context, in these situations, and context is no more than one, for this type can characterize it, then this family of medication will work. And I think that this form of instructional principles can exist and we should look for them. And in that sense, education is a science because we could find out these instructional principles. And I think that the reason is that, and that's also the reason that it works in education and medicine, the medical field, is that we are wired the same way. So because we're wired the same way, there are some things that will work in a similar fashion, and we still need to choose what's right for us. But the purpose of abstraction is to say some of the variables may be interesting, but are not really relevant. They may add some noise, but they don't do much more than that. And so the process of abstraction, which I personally think is critical actually, is to remove these surface features. And then I would say the narratives are, once we establish instructional principles, then we can use these narratives to share, or narrative research, to share experiences and to show exactly, basically that, to show how we adapted the general principle to our needs.
Sure. Yeah, there's epidemiological similarities, of course. And we have very well-established ways of teaching. Apprenticeship is very good, very well-established, very widespread, very sound model for teaching learning. The factory model of education, which we are inhabiting now, I'm not sure that's quite so successful. I mean, it's very widespread. And I think so, when you're talking about looking at these finer grain things, well, how can we make something work within this strange context? Yeah. But yeah, of course you're right. Yeah, absolutely. I may have stated things a little strongly. But provocative.
Ask about the disciplinary commons. So
Right.
I can imagine that in the UK, within a couple of hours of London, there are hundreds of institutions to pull from to get people involved in a project like that. Are you aware of that being instantiated in place? Does it work in North America where geographically far more spread out?
Yeah, well, I mean, even in the UK, we had people from Scotland and Ireland, so we have people travelling 4 hours each way to come. The Software Engineering Commons that ran in St. Louis, they had people flying in from New Jersey. They had to stay overnight, but yeah, so yes, people would travel. It puts a heavier burden because you need a bit more money and you need a bit more commitment. But, yeah.
Commons get credit within their own departments. So I know a lot of departments will get journal papers, and do you go to this conference? And it seems in education, in order to get similar amounts of credit, you have to do that too and follow the pattern. And here we're ignoring the pattern and trying something different.
I think by and large their departments didn't mind. They let them go. There was no cost to them other than the time. But no, it wasn't seen as a great reward, an important thing to be doing. Well, let's change a little bit. The more we've done, so if we've had someone come to a conference from an institution, we're more likely to get someone from that institution again. So yes, maybe they are seeing the value in that sense, but it's certainly not explicit.
You said that they came out of it with more credibility, I believe, in their institution.
They certainly report that.
What all these other places do.
They certainly report that.
That would help.
Yeah, yes. But I don't think the institution sees that up front.
Yeah.
In a number of spots, at least it seemed to me that you're saying you take the narratives and people say, well, this is what works for me in my context.
Yep.
What does it mean to work?
They'll tell you. You know, if I...
Does it mean along the lines of the students are happier, I'm happier? Is there any sort of standardized thing?
I don't think there's anything standardised, but I mean,
we had better outcomes in certain types of tests.
You ask someone, you know, does your class work? You know, you use clickers in your class, does it work?
Sorry?
You use clickers in your class, does it work? And they'll tell you, you know. And you'll say, yeah, well, I tried it this way and I did that, and, you know. And I'll hear you and I'll listen and I'll judge and I'll take what I need from it. And, yeah. So I don't, no, there's no formula.
So how do we know when we're getting better? I guess that's what really the question is about. How do we know that when we apply these things, we're actually getting better outcomes with our students?
What do you want to know? I mean, like Bob and Alice, you know, Alice goes, this isn't working. I want them to learn pseudocode, I want them to learn flowcharts. This isn't working. Bob goes, yeah, right, well, let me tell you why. And Bob tells a story, says, you can do this and you can do this. And Alice, we don't actually know what Alice did. We don't know if Alice went away and said, oh, okay, I'll try that card thing. Whether she went, yeah, baloney. We actually don't know. We actually don't know. I think we have a very poor model of how teachers change their practice. We don't know. But it depends what you want to know.
I was wondering if you could speculate a little bit about the indexing in terms of what aspects or facets you think might be important to educators to have to search by.
I know. It's a really difficult problem. And so, as I said, we tried a couple of things. We tried in EPCOS to have these areas that we knew were important in project work, so people might look there. I've done some work. I don't know if you know the Nifty repository. Nifty assignments. It comes out. There's a session at the 6 CSC Symposium every year where people present assessments. Normally CS1, but not exclusively CS1. And they're complete. They have rationale, design, handouts, grading rubrics. You know, they're a complete package of assessment. There's a huge repository of these. And I did some work a couple of years ago, actually asking people who used it. So I was you see these repositories. No, people, digital libraries, open learning repositories, you know, you go, does anybody use them? And they go, oh, no. And they're very underused. So I actually did it the other way around, and I found people who'd used it and asked where they went and why they went and tiny numbers, you know, but they go there for personal professional reasons. So they go there because they're reviewing their curriculum. So it's a whole department thing. They go and say, we'll use this. This is a good one. Some of them go there because that's what they do. They're just constantly hoovering things up and looking around. And maybe it's like, you know, it's a personality type. You know, there are people who just do that. They just go, oh, that's good. I'm always on the lookout for something like that. And so there wasn't a single, in a sense, a single index wouldn't match. And so that's a problem. And that's why we're hoping that actually the curriculum, this very staid, authoritative document, which people might go to say, oh, look, we're doing it the way the ACO says. And if behind that we have, well, if you're teaching, human-centered design, and doing the HCI knowledge area, here's some stuff here's how they did it in a community college, here's how they did that there. That might be a hook. That's the best speculation I can give.
I'm very interested in what you're talking about in terms of narrative. I find the narrative is extremely powerful. But I'm also wondering, in terms of the narrative, connecting it back to a theoretical ground. And this I want to take back to an example that you gave. In the chemical factory with the onion rings, right? Because I have concerns that unless it is grounded, whatever we do in a theoretical perspective, we merely replicate without looking at what is behind it. So it becomes an application rather than an understanding or our best guess at what is happening.
Yes, so much there. Yes, I mean, and that's part of the frustration of the natural narrative, that it occurs where it needs to be. When people exchange stories, it occurs where it needs to happen. And as soon as you move away from that, as soon as you move to the persistent representation, then you create problems. And yes, so if you haven't got that naturalistic grounding, now, can we put theory there to help make us do the other stuff properly? Maybe. I'm very wary of going near literary theory, and that's the problem with using the word story. Literary theory. That people think story, it's Hollywood, it's going to have a beginning, middle, and end, and a heroine and a hero, and so I'm very wary of going. Some people go and talk about that, but I don't think that's the theory we need to look to.
But I think that what also gets with the exchange of narrative, which I think is extremely important, but I also, in dealing with people who are concerned with teaching or who are trying to find something, that it becomes a collection of things that are done.
Yeah, that's the best.
An understanding behind that.
Absolutely.
And that really concerns me.
That's a huge risk. The course portfolios are lovely. The disciplinary commons portfolios are lovely. But, between you and me, they're huge. They take a lot of time to read. They take a lot of time to understand. They're quite unwieldy. They're hard to index into. And, in a sense, it's almost like being there. You have to do so much work to come to terms with what they're doing. But they're still narrative representations, and they're very thick and rich and detailed. But yes, as soon as you take them out of that context in which they evolve, you have a hard time. And I haven't cracked it. I don't think we've cracked it either. The very sparse, lean representations of the tips and tricks and the bundles and what have you, or the very thick ones. We're just trying things out.
So maybe you could join me in thanking our speaker again, Sally.